Canada has taken such a stride forward in her theatrical life during the past 5 years. This is the day of a theatrically new Canada. Optimism is rampant. Thousands of eager spenders have been created, as it were, overnight. Hence, musical comedies and vaudeville have taken a vigorous vogue, likely to continue indefinitely. That quote comes from a January 1913 article in the New York Dramatic Mirror. Marcus Loew may have been encouraged by this report because he was planning to build a new theater in Toronto. Actually, it was two new theaters, one stacked on top of the other inside a single building. The upper one would be called the Winter Garden. The lower one would be called Loew's Yonge Street Theater. But today, we know it as the Elgin. This week, we will be talking about the Elgin and Winter Garden theaters, the last stacked theaters in the world. I'm Adam Weiser.
And I'm Grayson Miller, and this is Muddy York.
Imagine that it's 1913, and you're wandering through downtown Toronto looking to see a show. You've got several different choices. There's the Princess Theatre at King and University, or the Royal Alexandra, which only opened 6 years ago. That's where you go to see legitimate theatre. A little further down the respectability scale were the Grand Opera House and the Majestic, both on Adelaide. They specialized in melodramas, comedies, and musicals. If you were feeling more risque, the Gaiety and the Star were the largest burlesque theaters in town. The last major choice would be Shea's Victoria Theatre, the only major vaudeville theatre in Toronto. Vaudeville was like a continuous variety show, with different acts performing sets for up to 12 hours a day. It became extremely popular at the turn of the century, with performers traveling from city to city to perform their routines for new audiences. The reason that Shea's was the only game in town was because it was the local affiliate of the United Booking Office, a syndicate that set out to monopolize vaudeville bookings by blacklisting any person or theater that tried to operate independently. The Elgin and Winter Garden were built to challenge this syndicate and directly compete with Shea's.
Now, for most of its history, the theater that we know as the Elgin was called the Loew's Yonge Street Theater. It didn't become the Elgin until 1978, but to avoid confusion, we're going to just call it the Elgin regardless of what they called it at that time. Marcus Loew was a magnate in the entertainment industry. In less than a decade, he had moved from investing in penny arcades to early films to movie theaters and vaudeville. He would eventually become the founder of MGM Studios. But 1913, he operated a string of vaudeville and movie theaters in New York and other American cities. He was backed by some of the biggest names in legitimate theater who wanted to challenge the United Book Office's dominance in vaudeville. The construction of the Elgin and the Winter Garden was part of this challenge, and it was meant to become the flagship of a chain of Loew's theaters that would extend across Canada. For his part, Mike Shea of Face Theatre responded to this challenge by building Shea's Hippodrome, the largest capacity theater in Toronto. Building the Elgin and Winter Garden became somewhat controversial for a couple of reasons. For one thing, the theaters included architectural features that had never previously been used in Toronto, and new ideas about building had never been popular in this city. The local fire chief and the city architect both opposed the project and wouldn't give their approval until they had visited New York, at public expense, to examine some theaters that had already used these new building techniques. The other problem was that the city's architect office was under investigation for corruption, and there were claims that Loew had bribed officials to approve his newfangled designs.
The most obvious novelty is that the building would feature two theaters, with the Winter Garden stacked on top of the Elgin. This idea evolved from rooftop gardens that had been built on top of theaters over the last 20 years. These gardens provided a place for theatergoers to escape the summer heat. Remember, there was no AC. Over time, theaters started putting on shows in these gardens. The Olympia in New York had a heated rooftop garden, which they called the Winter Garden because it could be used in the dead of winter. And this is from where the Toronto Theatre would draw its name. Eventually, the new Amsterdam would be built with a rooftop theatre called Aerial Gardens built on top of the main auditorium. Another new feature was a lengthy lobby corridor leading to a foyer and auditorium that were actually closer to Victoria Street, where the land was cheaper. In this case, the city actually had cause for complaint, because the planning documents had described the building as Victoria Street Theatre and put the main entrance there. Loew's didn't mention that there would also be an entrance on Yonge Street.
Opening night for the Elgin came on December 15th, 1913, with an audience that included the Premier and the Mayor. Marcus Loew chartered a special train to bring his New York backers to Toronto for the show. The Winter Garden had its opening night 2 months later. To give you an idea about what you could expect to see at the Vaudeville Theatre, here are some of the nice performers. There was a drag queen comedian named Bert Savoy who dressed in a flaming red wig, an oversized curvaceous costume, and an enormous picture hat. A trampoline tumbling act called the Three Ernests. Moffat Laran & Co., who offered a series of unusual electrical demonstrations and showed the X-rays in active operation. A troupe of dog and monkey actors called Wormwood's Animals and Polly Prim, a dainty maid of melody. Performances lasted from noon until 11 p.m. All of these acts would perform 15 to 20-minute sets throughout the day, interspersed with short movies. They did this for 6 days a week before moving on to a new city or venue. The same acts would appear at both the Elgin and the Winter Garden, but there were differences between these two theaters. The Elgin was designed for the hoi polloi, with tickets costing between 10 cents and 25 cents. It had the usual theater decor with a domed ceiling, gold leaf on the plasterwork, and red brocade upholstery. The Winter Garden was considered the more prestigious stage. It was smaller than the Elgin, with reserved seats available for the higher price of 25 to 50 cents. It only presented a single evening show, and if a big-name vaudeville act like George Burns and Gracie Allen was booked, they would perform at the Winter Garden. Patrons got to the Winter Garden by way of a grand staircase or via 2 hand-operated elevators. The theater was decorated to resemble a garden with hand-painted flowers on the wall and real branches and leaves on the ceiling alongside twinkling lanterns. The columns became tree trunks and the stage was painted blue with a large moon overhead.
The plan to make the Winter Garden into Toronto's premier vaudeville theatre had mixed success. On one hand, the truly unique decor made it into a romantic venue for couples, and there are lots of stories of soldiers who spent their last night there before going overseas during World War I. However, there just weren't enough people willing to pay a higher price to see regular vaudeville acts, especially not with those same acts performing downstairs at half the price. I mean, 50 cents for a ticket. Do I look like Andrew Carnegie? As early as 1915, Loew's experimented with an all-movie schedule at the Winter Garden, but it didn't last. In 1922, it began to only host shows on Saturdays and holidays. During the week, it was used as rehearsal space. By 1927, performances at the Winter Garden had stopped entirely. They would briefly resume the following year, when the organ used to provide music for silent films in the Elgin started a fire that damaged the theater. Less than 12 hours after the fire had been extinguished, the Winter Garden was ready to present that day's performance. The Star reported that the general public seems quite satisfied to use the roof theater, while work goes on in the lower house. On June 16, 1928, the Winter Garden hosted its last show for the next 50 years.
A fun fact from this period is that if performers were running behind schedule on the other stage, projectionists were instructed to slow down the film. Sometimes they were said to be running almost in slow motion. Theater owners usually preferred movies to live performers because movies didn't show up late or belong to a union. Over time, audiences also came to prefer movies, especially when those movies began to speak. Vaudeville circuit was becoming stale, and its best performers were defecting to radio. In 1929, the Elgin was wired for sound, The first talkie to be shown was His First Glorious Night, starring John Gilbert. The advertising declared, "You've seen him make love, now hear him in his greatest romance." Theater revenues rose 61% in that first year of talkies, and 18 months later, it was announced that the Elgin would become a full-time movie theater. The Winter Garden was effectively abandoned. During the early 30s, the movies shown at the Elgin would usually change every week. Of the 48 movies shown in 1931, only 4 were popular enough to get a second week. MGM films were usually guaranteed at least 1 week of screening because the studio and the theater were owned by the same people. In 1935, a major renovation removed most of the reminders of the Elgin's history as a vaudeville theater. The orchestra pit was covered over, the chandelier was removed from the auditorium, and the grand stairway to the Winter Garden was blocked off from patrons.
In 1939, the Elgin hosted the Canadian premieres of The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind in particular was a blockbuster hit, playing for 8 weeks in 1940 and another 4 in 1941. However, its running length was a problem. It lasted almost 4 hours, which meant that the Saturday night show ended after midnight. Toronto the Good was famously strict about Sunday closure laws, and all commercial shows were supposed to be over by 11:45. The theater manager wound up putting out most of the lights before midnight, leaving just enough for moviegoers to leave safely. When TV arrived in Toronto during the 1950s, the Elgin began experimenting with different ideas to appeal to audiences. The people behind these ideas firmly believed that the best way to fight the small screen was to make the movies bigger. They tried 3D films. They tried CinemaScope movies, which were almost twice as wide as a regular film. They planned to try Cinerama, which involved 3 different projectors broadcasting on an even wider curved screen that extended along the side walls. The opera boxes along the side of the theater had to be removed to make way for the screen, and the former orchestra pit was filled in with cement to support the extra weight. However, they eventually changed their mind, and the Cinerama system was never installed. All of these gimmicks failed to attract new audiences.
In 1969, Loew sold his theater chain, including the Elgin, to famous players. As movie audiences began shifting to multiplexes in the suburbs, the Elgin began showing B-movies, grindhouse films, and softcore porn. In 1978, the name was changed to the Elgin Theater. Nobody is sure what inspired the new name, but one theory is that they did it to save money because they could reuse 3 of the letters from the giant Young marquee sign outside the theater. The new owners hadn't done much to maintain the building, and by 1981, it was in such bad condition that they were planning to demolish it. However, the Ontario Heritage Trust stepped in to purchase the theater. The last movie shown there before it was closed was What the Swedish Butler Saw, a Swedish-American erotic sex comedy with Martin Young as Jack the Ripper, which is just an odd sequence of words. The following year, the Elgin and Winter Garden were declared National Historic Sites as the last stacked theaters in the world.
In 1984, a local producer named Marlene Smith convinced the provincial government to let her use the Elgin for a Canadian production of the Broadway musical Cats. This might be surprising for people who only know the film, but Cats was a blockbuster hit, and Toronto was only able to stage it because the Elgin was available. In some ways, it was an ideal location. Cats has a large, sprawling set, which the Elgin could fit because of all of the work that had been done to accommodate the Cinerama system. There also wasn't a problem with painting the auditorium black for the show because it would have to be repainted anyways as part of any restoration. That's not to say there weren't problems. Because the orchestra pit had been filled in, the musicians had to perform in a second-story loft above the lobby, with the music being relayed through 22 speakers in the auditorium. The Toronto production of Cats was a massive hit. It ran for 2 years, and is credited with kickstarting the Toronto theater scene of the 80s and 90s. However, patrons who talked about how beautiful the Elgin was didn't realize that most of it was still a mess. They had only renovated as much of the theater as was necessary for the production.
In 1987, the province began a massive 2.5-year restoration of both theaters, using old photos to try to recreate their original look. In the lobby, this meant removing 25 layers of paint. In the Elgin, this included restoring the opera boxes that had been removed in 1960 and applying more than 250,000 sheets of metallic leaf to the gilding. The Winter Garden posed the biggest challenge. They wound up using bread dough to remove decades of dirt from the walls without ruining their murals, and 5,000 beech branches were used to recreate the ceiling. The original seats were gone, so they brought in 1930s chairs from the Biograph Theater in Chicago. Incidentally, the Biograph Theater was where John Dillinger, the famous bank robber, was shot, so one of those seats in the Winter Garden might have been the one he was using right before his death. During the restoration process, workers discovered 125 vaudeville backdrops that had been left behind when they stopped using the Winter Garden. This is the largest collection in the world, and several of these backdrops are displayed around the building. The Elgin officially reopened on December 15th, 1989, exactly 76 years after its first opening night. In 1990s, movies returned to the building when it became a regular TIFF venue. In 1994, it hosted the world premiere of the musical Napoleon. In 2004, it hosted the Conan O'Brien Show for a week. It supplied the interior of the theater for the film version of Chicago, which was mostly filmed in Toronto. It also supplied the interior of the cinema above, which the main character lives in the shape of water. Finally, it's been the regular home of the Ross Petty pantomimes that have been staged at Christmas almost every year since 1996. All too often, historic buildings in Toronto are forgotten and demolished. The Elgin and Winter Garden represent an alternative, a way to restore these buildings to their old glory and make them a part of our future as well as our past. So guys, that is the episode today. Thank you so much for listening to another great Muddy York podcast history episode. And please, guys, please like, share the podcast. That's how the algorithm works. We require you to share it, tell a friend, tell anybody. And if you want to reach out to us, we will share your messages on the show. And Adam, if you could share where they could reach out to us.
You can reach us by email at muddy_york@outlook.com. You can follow us on Twitter at Toronto_history, on Blue Sky at Muddy York, that's one word, or on Facebook at Muddy York History, also one word. And we will see you in April.